I was sitting at my kitchen table in Mississauga, still in my housecoat, holding a piece of mail that wasn't mine. My hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my coffee. The envelope was from TD Wealth Private Client Services, addressed to my nephew. The letter inside confirmed a portfolio balance of $842,000. The same nephew who had been sleeping in my spare bedroom for 3 years. The same nephew who had cried at this very table, telling me he couldn't make rent after his layoff. The same nephew I had been supporting, completely, every single month, while watching my own retirement savings slowly shrink. He walked through the front door 20 minutes later, grocery bags in both hands, smiling. He took one look at my face and set the bags down on the counter without saying a word. Let me go back. Let me tell you how a 63-year-old woman ends up sitting at her kitchen table feeling like the biggest fool in Ontario. I retired from dental hygiene 2 years earlier than I'd planned. My knees had been giving me trouble for years, and after nearly 4 decades of standing and bending over patients in that same position, my body had simply said enough. I got my pension, I had my RRSP, I had my condo on Hurontario Street that I'd paid off the year my husband passed. I wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but I was comfortable. I had a routine. Tuesday mornings at the community center for Aquafit. Thursday afternoons volunteering at the library. Every second Sunday at my sister Diane's place in Burlington for family dinner. I was fine. Quietly, decently fine. My nephew Ryan had always been the one I felt closest to out of Diane's 3 kids. Her oldest 2 had moved out west, one in Calgary, one in Vancouver, and they came home at Christmas if the flights weren't too expensive and left again before the Boxing Day sales were over. But Ryan had stayed in Ontario. He'd done well for himself in tech, some kind of UX design work that I never fully understood but that paid him very nicely. He'd had an apartment in Liberty Village, a lease on a car, a gym membership, the whole young professional package. Then the layoffs came. It was the tail end of the tech slowdown, the kind you kept reading about in the Globe and Mail, and Ryan's company cut an entire department in one afternoon. He called me that same evening. He didn't call his mother. He called me. I don't know why that mattered so much to me, but it did. He came over for dinner 2 nights later and he looked terrible. He'd lost weight. His eyes had that hollow quality I recognized from years of watching patients in chronic pain, the look of someone trying very hard to hold something together on the inside. He told me he'd been applying everywhere. He told me tech hiring had frozen up completely. He said he had maybe 2 months of savings left before he couldn't cover his rent, and that he was too embarrassed to tell his mother because Diane would immediately launch into a lecture about how he should have been saving more, investing smarter, making different choices. His father had left when Ryan was 9. There wasn't any help coming from that direction. I heard myself say, before I'd even thought it through, that he should come stay with me, just until he found something. The spare bedroom was sitting empty. I had the space. He was family. He moved in the following weekend with 2 suitcases and a backpack. I want to be honest about what those first weeks felt like, because I think this part matters. I liked having him there. I liked cooking for 2 again. I liked hearing the shower running in the morning and knowing someone else was in the apartment. My condo had been so quiet since Robert died, the kind of quiet that fills up and becomes its own presence. Having Ryan there displaced that quiet, and I was more relieved than I'd expected to be. He registered for employment insurance right away, and I helped him go through the paperwork. The EI payments were modest, a fraction of what he'd been earning, and I told him not to worry about contributing to groceries or utilities until he was back on his feet. It would only be a few months, we both thought. A few months became 6, then a year. The tech market wasn't recovering the way the articles kept promising it would. Ryan was doing some freelance work, small contracts here and there, but nothing consistent. He'd pick up a project, invoice the client, wait 45 days to get paid, and by then the next contract wasn't lined up yet. The income was erratic and he was clearly stressed. I told him the same thing every time. Don't worry about the money, focus on the work, it'll come together. My Thursday friend Patricia asked me once over coffee at Tim Hortons, with that careful tone people use when they're trying to ask something without quite asking it, whether I thought Ryan was really trying as hard as he could. I told her I thought he was doing his best in a difficult market. She nodded and changed the subject. I didn't bring it up again because I didn't like the implication. By the 18-month mark, I had paid for essentially everything. Groceries, hydro, internet, his phone plan because his had lapsed, 2 visits to a walk-in clinic for things OHIP didn't fully cover, a new laptop when his old one finally died, the cost of a professional portfolio website I'd paid a local designer to build for him. I told myself each expense was an investment in getting him back on his feet faster. I even transferred him $2,000 one month when a client he'd done work for went suddenly bankrupt and stiffed him on a $1,200 invoice. I was spending easily $1,500 to $2,000 a month beyond my normal costs. Not all in one place, never in one dramatic transfer that would have forced me to reckon with it. Groceries here, a phone bill there, a quiet envelope of cash when he seemed particularly down. It added up slowly the way water adds up in a basement by the time you notice it. It's already been there a while. Diane knew he was living with me. She thanked me at Sunday dinner once, briefly. In the vague way people thank you for something they're relieved. They don't have to deal with themselves. Her husband Keith nodded along. Nobody asked how I was managing financially. I didn't tell them. I was 63 years old and I was supplementing my nephew's life out of my retirement savings, and I had told no one. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself family takes care of family. I told myself that if it were me, Robert would have done the same. I told myself a lot of things while I logged into my RBC online banking at midnight and watched my savings account balance go in one direction only. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in February. The Aquafit class had been canceled due to a burst pipe at the community center, so I was home. The mail slot in our building lobby had been acting up, shuffling envelopes between units, and it wasn't the first time I'd received something that wasn't mine. I opened it without looking at the name on the envelope. A bad habit I'd never managed to break. TD Wealth Private Client Services, portfolio statement. 4 pages of investments managed funds, growth ETFs, something listed as a discretionary account. And at the bottom right of the first page, the total, $842,000. I read it 3 times, I set it down and drank the rest of my coffee, which had gone cold. I picked it up and read it again. Then I went and sat on the edge of my bed for a while, which is something I hadn't done since the morning after Robert's funeral, just sat there, not quite being anywhere. When Ryan came home, I was back at the kitchen table. He took one look at my face and put down the grocery bags. I slid the letter across the table toward him. He looked at it. Then he looked at me. He sat down slowly, like his legs had stopped working properly. I want to say, I shouted. I want to say I was furious right away. That I flipped over the kitchen table and threw him out into the February cold, and that was that. But that's not what happened. What happened was I asked him, in a voice so even and controlled it didn't sound like mine at all, to explain. He did. His father, the one who had left when Ryan was 9, had died 4 years ago. Ryan hadn't told anyone in the family, hadn't known quite how to explain the complicated grief of losing a man you'd spent 30 years being angry at. The estate had gone through probate in British Columbia, and Ryan had inherited a substantial amount his father had, apparently, been quietly successful in commercial real estate in the Fraser Valley, the kind of quiet success that doesn't require anyone to know about it. After taxes and legal fees, Ryan had walked away with just over $800,000, which he'd placed with a wealth manager at TD, and largely left alone because he hadn't known what to do with it and hadn't felt entitled to it somehow, hadn't felt like it was real money he'd earned. He'd been laid off from his job the following year. He had come to me because, he said, he genuinely didn't know how to ask his mother and stepfather for anything without it becoming a whole family conversation about his father and the inheritance and how much he had and whether he should share it, all of which felt impossible to him. And then, he said, he'd planned to tell me. After a month, maybe 2, he'd planned to tell me the truth and start contributing properly. But 1 month became 3, and 3 became 6, and by then, how did he explain that he'd let his 63-year-old aunt drain her retirement account while he sat on nearly $1 million? He said every one of those things quietly, looking at the table, and when he finished, he looked up at me and said, "I'm so sorry, I don't have an excuse. I just kept not knowing how to say it, and the longer it went, the worse it got." I got up, washed my coffee cup, dried it, put it back in the cupboard. I told him I needed a few days. He asked if he should leave. I said yes. He booked himself into a hotel on Ontario. My sister called that night, which meant he'd told her something. I let it ring. I let it ring twice more after that. I sat in my quiet condo with his 2 suitcases still in the spare room, and I stared at the wall for a while. My friend Patricia came by the next afternoon with a container of her lentil soup, which is what she does when she senses something has gone wrong and doesn't want to ask directly. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always valued about her. When I finished, she said, "That's a terrible thing he did." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead. When did you feel most like yourself these past 3 years?" "When did you feel the most, I don't know the right word. Purposeful?" I didn't answer right away because I already knew what the answer was and I didn't like it. "It was when he needed me," I said. She nodded. "That's what I thought." I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about what Patricia had said and turning it around, looking at it from different angles the way you do with something you don't want to be true. My sister Diane had always been the one who was given things. I want to be fair about this because Diane hadn't asked to be the favorite. These things happen in families without anyone deciding on them. But she had been given the nicer bedroom, the newer clothes, the special consideration. When our father got sick, it was Diane who lived close enough to help and got to be the good daughter in everyone's eyes, while I drove 4 hours from Toronto every other weekend and nobody particularly noticed. When our mother passed, she left Diane the jewelry, and she left me the practical things, the good dishes, the linen set, a modest amount of cash. I had never said a word about any of it. I had been the sensible one, the self-sufficient one, the one who handled things. I had built an identity out of not needing anyone, and out of being needed instead. I thought about the relief I'd felt when Ryan called me that first night instead of calling his mother. I thought about how gently I had redirected every conversation where Patricia or my other friends had nudged me to ask more questions about Ryan's situation. I thought about how I'd never once asked to see his bank account, or asked him to account for his EI payments, or asked him to sit down and make a plan. I had been the one to say, "Don't worry, I've got it," every time he'd offered to look into part-time work. He'd offered 3 separate times in the first year. I had told him to focus on finding something real, something in his field. I had kept him exactly where I needed him to be. That thought sat in my chest like a cold stone, and it sat there for several days. My daughter-in-law, my late son's wife Claire, who has remained close to me since Michael passed, and who I think of as my own, called me on the Thursday. Ryan had reached out to her separately, which surprised me, and she'd put together enough of the picture to call and ask if I was all right. I told her what had happened, all of it, including what Patricia had said, including what I'd been sitting with by myself in the dark. She was quiet for a moment on the other end. Then she said, "Aunt Carol, he still lied to you. That's real. That's not nothing. Whatever your reasons were for enjoying feeling needed, he made a choice every single day for 3 years not to tell you the truth. I know." But she paused. "You didn't deserve to be lied to. And you also have to be honest with yourself about what you were looking for in this arrangement. Both things are true at the same time. I had been a dental hygienist for 38 years. I was not someone who went to therapy. I had grown up in a generation and a household where you solved your own problems, and you did not pay someone $60 an hour to watch you cry about your childhood. But I called my family doctor the following week and asked for a referral, and she sent me to a counselor named Dr. Ose, who worked out of an office in Oakville and who had the most straightforward manner of any professional I had ever encountered. In our second session, after I had laid out the whole story, he said, "When your nephew called you that first night instead of his mother, what did you feel?" "Needed," I said immediately. "And what does being needed mean to you?" I thought about it properly, the way he had asked me to think about things, slowly, without deflecting. "It means I matter," I said. "It means I have a place." He nodded and didn't say anything, which was the most pointed response he could have given. I thought about Diane and the jewelry. I thought about the Sunday dinners where I drove 45 minutes and sat quietly, while Keith talked about his investments, and Diane's kids called home on video, and I sat there being pleasant and practical and necessary. I had spent 63 years being useful because being loved outright felt too uncertain. "What were you getting?" Dr. Ose asked, from not questioning whether his story was true. "I didn't want to check," I said. "Because if I checked and it turned out he was fine, he wouldn't need me anymore." I sat with that for a long time. Ryan called from the hotel on the 12th day. I answered. I need to say this properly, he said. What I did was wrong. There is no version of it that is okay. You are 63 years old, and I let you spend your retirement savings on me while I had nearly $1 million in an account, and I told myself it would be temporary, and I kept not fixing it, and that was cowardly and selfish. I am genuinely ashamed. I believed him. Not because I needed to, but because I had known Ryan for 35 years, and I could hear the difference between the voice he used when he was managing a situation and the voice he was using now. I also need to tell you something else, he said. Go ahead. I offered to contribute 3 times in the first year. And each time I did, I felt almost relieved when you said no. Because if I wasn't contributing, I didn't have to explain why I could suddenly afford to contribute. I used your generosity as a reason not to have to tell the truth, and that's on me. But I also watched you say no every time, and I wondered sometimes whether you needed this arrangement as much as I did. That was the most honest sentence anyone had said to me in perhaps years. I told him I had been thinking about the same thing. We talked for 2 hours. About his father, about the grief he hadn't let himself have, about the inheritance that had felt like blood money from a man who had been absent for 30 years and had tried to compensate for it at the end, with money the way people who don't know how to be present always try to compensate. With money. About my marriage to Robert and how his death had left me with a kind of uselessness I had never quite known how to name. About Diane and the jewelry and the decades of being the sensible one. About how we had both walked into this arrangement carrying things we hadn't told each other and possibly hadn't told ourselves. Can we find a way back from this? He asked. I'm not asking to move back in. I'll find my own place. I should have done that a long time ago, but I don't want to lose you. I told him I didn't want to lose him either. But I told him that things would have to be different. Honest. Actually honest, not just comfortable. He said he knew. He said he was already talking to someone, a therapist he'd found in the city, specifically about the inheritance and his father, and why he had made the choices he made. He'd started the week before. I'll pay you back everything, he said. Every dollar. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for a week. I decided I didn't want it as repayment. I wanted to deal with the money the way it actually was. He had it. I had less than I should. I asked him, instead of repayment, to set up a contribution to a TFSA in my name for the amount I calculated I had spent directly on him over 3 years. We got an accountant involved, actually, which felt very Canadian and practical and somehow appropriate. We sat down together in February at an office on King Street and went through it properly. The total came out to just under $40,000. He transferred it without argument. I went back to my routine. Aquafit on Tuesdays, library on Thursdays. Sunday dinners at Diane's, where I now, for the first time in a long while, said things when I had something to say instead of being pleasant and sensible and silent. Diane looked startled the first few times. Keith looked mildly irritated. I didn't particularly mind. Dr. Osei and I kept meeting, monthly now instead of weekly. He had a way of asking questions that got past the part of me that had been running a very long efficiency program on my own emotions for 6 decades. I started to understand that the condo had felt quiet, not just because Robert was gone, but because I had never particularly allowed it to feel full in ways that didn't depend on someone needing something from me. I took a trip in the spring, just myself, to Prince Edward Island. I had always wanted to go and had always found a reason not to. I drove the Confederation Bridge, ate lobster rolls in Cavendish, walked along the red cliffs in the early morning when the light came sideways across the water. I called Patricia from a bench outside a bakery in Charlottetown, and she asked if I was happy, and I told her I was working on understanding what that meant, which she said was the most honest answer she'd heard in years. Ryan found an apartment in Etobicoke, a nice one, 2 bedrooms, because he could afford it, and because he finally let himself afford things without the guilt of the inheritance hanging over him. He had gone back to work too, a full-time position with a mid-sized agency downtown, the kind of stable contract he probably could have found years earlier if he hadn't been hiding from his own circumstances. He came for dinner twice a month. We cooked together, which was something we'd never done when he'd been living with me. I had cooked, he had eaten, that had been the arrangement. Now he made the salad and I made the main, and we stood in my kitchen and talked while the CBC played in the background the way it always does in a certain kind of Ontario kitchen. It wasn't perfect. There were dinners where I caught myself starting to slip into the old dynamic, asking if he was managing okay, wondering if I should offer something. There were times he went quiet about things, and I had to remind myself that his quietness was not my emergency to solve. We were both, as Dr. Osei put it, learning new habits in a very old relationship. One Sunday evening in October, he arrived for dinner, and he handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten card and a printed confirmation from the Canadian Red Cross, a donation in my name to their National Disaster Relief Fund. Not huge, not showy, just a thing he had done. "This doesn't fix anything," he said, "but I wanted you to have something that was just yours." I put the card on my fridge with a magnet shaped like a maple leaf that had been there since the late 90s, and I'm not entirely sure where it came from. I think about those 3 years sometimes. I think about the version of myself who opened the mail every month and wrote out the e-transfers and told herself it was love, purely love, when it was also something else, a need to be central, to be necessary, to be the person who could not be left because she was the one holding everything together. My nephew lied to me. He let me pay for his life for 3 years while he had money sitting in a managed portfolio, and he told himself he'd fix it later, and then later kept not arriving. That was wrong. That is the simple, true part of this story. But I was also, in my own way, not entirely honest, not with him and not with myself. I had needed someone to need me, and I had not asked the questions that would have interrupted that arrangement, because deep down I had not wanted it interrupted. I had liked being essential. I had liked being the aunt he called instead of his mother. I had liked having the spare bedroom full and the kitchen noisy, and a reason to cook a proper meal on a weekday evening. I am 64 now. I have enough in my RRSP for a reasonable retirement, not the comfortable buffer I had planned, but enough. My knees still hurt in the cold. I still go to Aquafit on Tuesdays. I still volunteer at the library, and I have started, in the last few months, running a Thursday afternoon reading group for seniors that I enjoy more than I had expected to. I am not quiet the way I used to be quiet. I am not useful the way I used to be useful. I am working on being present instead, which is harder and also better. My nephew calls on Sundays, not because anything needs fixing, but because he wants to talk. Last week he called to tell me about a show he'd seen at the AGO, a painter I hadn't heard of, and we talked for 40 minutes about art, and about his father, and about what it means to have money you didn't earn, and how to carry that without letting it define you. Before we hung up, he said, "I still feel terrible about what I did." "I know," I said. "I hope you can forgive me someday." "I'm working on it," I told him, "but I'm also working on forgiving myself, so we'll get there together." There was a pause on the line and I could hear him smiling. "That sounds like you," he said. "It does," I said. "Finally it does."